Hi, my name is Rachel Gibson, and I'm with the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. So excited that you're here to join us for Nebraska Schools 101. This is about public education in Nebraska, and we hope to point you to some good resources and give you just a quick overview of the different elements of our public school system here in Nebraska. So first, a little bit about us. The League of Women Voters of Nebraska is a nonpartisan, nonprofit grassroots organization with a focus on voters' role in democracy. One portion of this is legislative advocacy, so reviewing bills, writing position letters, engaging the public, educating the public. And this is what Schools 101 falls under. We want to help cut through some of the noise about education and public education policy in Nebraska so that you have the tools you need to make informed decisions when you vote for elected officials at all levels. We have 6 different areas that we work in. This is, again, under our education policy, but if any of these look interesting to you, feel free to join our coalition here. Our team is made up of 5 wonderful women here in Nebraska, and we're very lucky that one of them is an actual teacher. So as we were talking through this setup, she said, you know, the way I think about it is the way I teach, which is starting with learning objectives. So to give some context of where we're headed today, we're going to talk about the purpose of schools. We're going to briefly touch on the history of public schools, and then we're going to talk about different types of schooling. And finally, we'll hit on how schools are funded, specifically here in Nebraska, and then a little bit about curriculum and instruction. And finally, recognizing the impact of parents, families, and communities on schools, because public schools really are that. They are community schools. So here's the point when we give this presentation live that we have people brainstorm about what the purpose of public schools in the US is. And it's always kind of interesting to see the wide variety of things that people think of, and all of them are true on some level. We often hear about basic academics. We usually hear about some sort of common unifying experience. You know, in my age, if you remember in gym class when we had parachute day, where they put the big parachute and you sit on it and it makes a bubble on the inside, that's a common experience. I'm sure some of you are like, oh my gosh, I love parachute day. That's what we mean by common unifying experience. But it also can mean things deeper about societal norms and things like that. Public schools often serve as community services or centers. Think about a lot of places offer voting. So your voting, your polling location may be in a school, but also things like when COVID happened, one of our schools locally became a place where people could pick up meals. So it really is that community idea. Civic education is one that some people don't think of, but it's a really important piece. If we're an informed electorate and we're governing ourselves as democracies do, then we need some civic education that is common among all of us. And then moral and societal norms. So this kind of goes back to that common or unifying experience. But, you know, when I look at my my kindergartner, part of what they're learning, part of their curriculum is about sharing, is about communicating. It's about, you know, how do we interact with one another? It's learning about the United States and our history and the values of freedom and democracy. So it's those moral and societal norms too. The point of this is that public schools have always had a big place in our communities. So really quickly, we're going to talk about the history of public schools in the US. So when we first got here, it was really a mix of things. There were certain places that wanted schooling, and so they might have started a school, but it was not widely accessible. As we got into the 1780s, and you know, with the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers realized that we needed an informed electorate, and part of that was that need to educate citizens. So this led to this idea of public schools. However, it was not widely accepted. Jurisdictions were all over the place. It really did vary based on where you were at. It wasn't until the 1830s when we came to this idea of what we really think of as the American public school. also called the Common School. And this movement was led by Horace Mann in Massachusetts. And he identified education as a public investment just as much as a personal investment. And so Massachusetts really did start the first universally available state-funded public schools, which is now the model we use across the country. In the late 1800s, there was some uneven expansion. Different states chose to do different things. When Nebraska became a state in our Constitution, it is required to provide education for every student. But access and what that looked like varied greatly, particularly between rural and urban schools. In the early 1900s, there was this really interesting push and pull. So on one token, schools really became a place of assimilation. There was a huge influx of immigrants from Europe, and public schools became the place to learn about American culture, how to be an American. What's interesting is at that same time, there was an even more of a push towards segregation. So certain races, classes, all sorts of things, separating those so that there could be some control on the different access that folks had. So it was a really interesting push and pull. In the 1960s, this is when a lot of people think about some of our most hallmark, most respected and valued education policies. So this was during the Civil Rights Movement. And this is when Brown versus the Board of Education, which basically outlawed segregation. It said separate but equal, which was the previous ruling, was not actually possible. You can't do that. So there's no segregation in schools. And a lot of times people think of this as a racial civil rights movement, and that's a big portion of it, but it also related to access for those with disabilities and other sorts of integration and trying to make that educational equity across the country. And then finally, the most recent shift in the history of public schools is towards this idea of accountability and competition. As we have evolved as a society and more technology is available, we've been able to test more regularly. We've been able to compare things easier, which has kind of led to this, this idea that schools need to be held accountable. The No Child Left Behind Act really formalized that, but it also provided this new way of teaching, because if the focus is on the outcome, does it matter how it's taught, which is the rise of charter schools and some private schools and things like that. So this is the context of where we're at now. Let's talk a little bit about different types of schools. So the way I think about this is that we have options, and here in Nebraska, quite a few options of different schools our children can attend. How these vary depend on three things: who can attend, what's taught, and what the funding source is. So this is a big chart. Don't worry, I have a little highlighter that goes through each one, so we'll talk through it real quick. Traditional public, this is what people predominantly think of as public or community schools. Who can attend? All students. It's usually based on place of residence. They generally accept all students, with very, very few that's not the case. And usually there's an extenuating circumstance. What's taught is a basic curriculum that's set by the state Board of Education. And we'll get into a little later how that curriculum trickles down to the actual classroom. And then finally, where does the money come from this? Taxes. Also, we'll talk about what types of taxes in just a little bit. The second type of school we have is a charter school. And we actually don't have any charter schools here in Nebraska, but these very much exist in other places. I think actually in New Orleans, all of the schools, public schools, are charter schools, which is kind of an interesting model. Charter schools, the first thing I always remind people is that these are public schools. They're public schools. The way so they're paid for by taxes, but the way they differ from your traditional public school is sometimes who can attend. It might depend on the district. There's some school choice models, like I mentioned, in New Orleans, you rank which one you want to attend to. So there's some difference in who can attend. And then what's taught is really where charter schools are different. Highly flexible. They're exempt from some of the requirements that traditional public schools are outlined to adhere to, but the trade-off is higher accountability, which has created some kind of interesting models in different places. The third type of public school you probably hear about is a magnet school. So a magnet school is usually in a specialized area. So again, public school funded by taxes, but it specializes in some particular area. For example, my younger brother went to an arts magnet. He had 2 or 3 art classes every single year through high school, which is not the common experience in public high schools. So it's that concept. There are often STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math related magnet schools, but really it's that specific focus. Who can attend? Again, this is largely open. However, sometimes it's based on opt-in, sometimes it's based on a specific ability, and sometimes it's a lottery or some mix of those. So that takes care of the main types of public schools. Let's shift gears and talk about private schools. I separate private schools into private and religious private. And here in Nebraska, we often think of all private schools being religious, and we have a lot of them, so that makes sense. But separating those two is helpful to think about the different types of schools that exist in our state. So who can attend? Both private schools and private religious schools have the ability to restrict who can attend. So it could be based on test scores, it could be based on experience, it could be based on essays. It's a little bit more like college in that you apply and you are viewed as an applicant in many cases. And I should say private schools vary greatly in how they're run, but generally there is some sort of ability to not admit everyone. What's taught, usually it's very focused on the school. Oftentimes it's usually the same general curriculum that the state uses, but maybe specialized classes or different ways of teaching, electives, those different types of things. And then finally, how is it funded? Tuition. So money that parents and families pay to have their students attend. Religious private is very similar as far as what's taught and who can attend. The one difference I would say here is that oftentimes in a religious school setting, you have maybe a required religion class, or there's a religious element built into every lesson. So that's one difference. The other is that sometimes with who can attend, it's related on religious affiliation or different groups that you're a part of. And again, the main driving funding source is tuition. And again, this varies. I went to Catholic high school in Wichita, Kansas, and they have a model there that if you are a member of a local parish and you tithe, they've managed to find a way to fund education for any Catholic student. So, you know, it wasn't an out-of-pocket cost, but it still, again, was based on, it wasn't public tax money being used. And then finally, homeschooling. And homeschooling, who can attend, who lives in your house, what's taught, it's very family dependent. I will say though, there are often curriculum packages, products that are sold, or some people use the state curriculum standards and just kind of tweak it. There's lots of options for what that looks like. And then of course, the funding source is personal. So that gives a snapshot of the different types of schools, how they differ based on who can attend, what's taught, and the funding source. So let's talk about education in the US. Who are we talking about? What does our student enrollment look like? There are 50.7 million students in public schools in the United States. You can see the breakdown between kindergarten and then high school age. And I would like to point out that of that roughly 51 million, 3.3 million, or about 7%, are in charter schools. And I point this out because sometimes in policy, we spend a lot of time talking about you know, the more unusual setup or a different way of approaching things. And that takes up all the oxygen in the room. So that's kind of a helpful way to put it back in context to say, okay, when we're talking about these programs, what percent, how many students are we actually talking about? So when we talk about public schools in the United States, and definitely in Nebraska, we're usually talking about traditional public schools. Nationally, there are about 5.7 million students in private schools. So 10% of the students in school in the United States are in private schools. 25% of all schools are classified as private schools. So if you look at that number, there are fewer students in more schools, and that has an impact on the student to teacher ratio, access to resources, things like that. So that's just a helpful piece of context. 66% of private schools nationally are religiously affiliated. And again, being in the Midwest, particularly in Omaha, I was surprised. I thought that was kind of low. But then when you think about the history of a lot of the boarding schools and private schools on the coasts, it made a little more sense. Let's talk about governance in public education. It really comes down to the student, because I, as a parent, want to know how my student is getting the information that they get. What does this look like? Who makes these decisions? And what's interesting is that it's almost like a series of circles about how close to the student a different layer is that impacts what they learn. So the closest you have is the classroom, your teacher, your paras, your classmates, things like that. The next level is your school. So that's, all the classes together, your principal, the PE teacher, whoever it might be. One step larger is the district. So the collection of schools that are kind of governed in the same area. Usually this is geography related. And there's huge variation in the size of Nebraska. So district can mean different things in different places. And then finally, the last kind of touch point, farthest away from the student that still has an impact, is the state. The model of the US system of education is one of the most decentralized in the world. If you want to see what a centralized system looks like, take a look at France. Theirs is highly, highly centralized. What does that mean? It means that jurisdiction, responsibility, funding, authority is mostly at the local or the state level. And when you think about this, as you're thinking about the governments and the decisions that get made, they happen at these different levels, mostly closer to the students. So, for example, when we're talking about staffing, that could be a school decision or partially a district decision, or based on how much is being provided in budget from the state. So it touches all of those. Budget, curriculum, long-term planning, weather closures, is that a district level thing? In Omaha it is, whereas like, is OPS have school yet? What's that mean for West Side or Ralston or that type of thing? So that's a district level decision. So think of all these different decisions getting made at different levels that impact your students' experience. I like to give an example of curriculum in particular and how it relates to student. This has been a hot topic lately in Nebraska, particularly with some of our different standards, curriculum standards or guidelines. So how does curriculum actually work? How do decisions get made about what your student learns in the classroom? And I, again, have to give a shout out to the educator who's on our action team who used this example. She teaches middle school, so she had this one ready to go. So let's start the widest. At the state sets curriculum standards or guidelines depending on the topic area. Let's say we're talking about a middle school English class. Middle school English, every 7th grader in Nebraska needs to complete a unit on identity, all those coming of age stories and those types of things, so identity. So then at the district level, what does that look like? Well, the district says every 7th grader to learn about identity is going to read The Outsiders, the book The Outsiders. Great read if you haven't read it yet. So then the school says, okay, the district has told us we need to learn about identity. We're going to read the Outsiders. We're going to have that happen in the spring. So our 3 7th grade classes are all going to read The Outsiders in the spring to learn about identity. And then the classroom is where that teacher makes the decision, how do I make this work for my kids, for my students? So an example would be every 7th grader at this school is going to read The Outsiders in the spring and write a persuasive essay to demonstrate they understand identity. So you'll see like the different layers of how that boils down to your student. So when people think about curriculum or standards or guidelines, again, those are kind of a really high level look that then get to be interpreted at closer and closer local levels to the actual education of your student. Let's talk about public education funding. Woohoo. So we're talking about just public schools right now. All public schools are funded by taxes. And usually they're funded by some combination of 3 different types of taxes. You've got your local taxes, which is usually the primary source. And these are most often tied to property taxes. So nationally, about 45% of a school's budget would be coming from that local source. The second largest are state taxes. So these are maybe general funds that get sent to all schools. They might be for a specific program, or they might be used for what's called equalization. And this makes up about 47 nationally. So actually, it's one of the largest, depending on the state you're in. Now I want to touch on equalization. The concept of equalization is basically, it's one we use here in Nebraska, and it's basically looking at schools and saying, you know, this school has this need, but they only have this much resources, and that may be through no fault of their own. So we're going to give them a little more to equalize out, to make sure that their funding is adequate and comparable to maybe a student in a different situation. And about, I would say about half of our school districts are equalized in the state of Nebraska, and they are all over the place. There's some in Omaha, there are some way out west. It really is looking at the costs that schools have and the resources they have access to in an effort to make things more equitable across the state. All right, the third type of taxes is federal. And this is usually the smallest piece of the pie. And it's usually provided for a very specific program. So remember that we're one of the most decentralized systems. Not a lot of money comes from the federal government, but also not a lot of requirements come from the federal government as well. Again, very, very local. Now, I want to touch on property tax implications, because particularly in Nebraska, where property tax payments are fairly high, it's good to understand how this impacts. Why do people use property tax? Why do states use property tax as the main way to fund their schools? Some of the positives, it's very stable. So if you think about, well, compared to other taxes, that is. So think about the COVID years. You know, if we were basing things on income tax or sales tax, that would really be a roller coaster for our budgets, right? So the stability of property taxes is a benefit. It also reaffirms that local funding decision. If there's a community that schooling is their #1 priority, and they say, hey, yeah, tax us a little more because we want that to go to our schools, again, that's a local decision. Some downsides: property taxes are a reflection of a community, and the amount of taxes gathered often reflect more of the oppression and the systemic discrimination of a community rather than the value and the ability of a community. So the idea of less valuable land, which has been usually given to certain communities or placed in certain areas of town with high poverty, brown and Black communities, that usually ends up meaning less funding because the land is deemed less valuable. And that goes back to the school. So that's kind of the unfortunate cycle. That's the downside of property taxes. Education funding by the numbers. I love a good color-coded map. So one way that we often talk about funding is in terms of cost per pupil or cost per student. And you'll see here that it really ranges in the United States, with New York being the highest, 25,000, Idaho being the lowest, a little under 8,000, and Nebraska kind of squarely in the middle. So our price per pupil is in the middle range, and it's comparable to the states around us. There are a few states that spend less, some that spend more, that touch us, but generally in our area, it's pretty reflective. So when we talk about this, what are schools spending? $7.52 billion is what they're spending nationally. So we're talking about a lot of money. The average per student, I gave the specific example there, is around 13,000. So again, Nebraska's just shy of that. Now I want to shift gears and just briefly touch on private school and tuition, because that does impact funding. So across the nation, the average yearly tuition to private school is $12,530. The median is slightly higher than that. And a really important point here is that sometimes people will say, well, let's look at the price per student, price per pupil here in Nebraska is $12,000. Well, if tuition's only $9,000 at some given place, why is there a difference in achievement or that type of thing? The argument of, well, the private schools may be doing more with less money. Not exactly an apples to apples comparison. So tuition usually accounts for 60 to 70% of private school revenue. So those aren't the exact same comparison. They might be getting funding from other places. In my own example from before, I attended a Catholic school that the diocese put in a lot of money, as opposed to some of the tuition of the other students. So that's just something to keep in mind, that those aren't an apple to apple comparison. So what are public schools spending this money on? This is a snapshot nationally, and you'll see there that 80% of what's spent in our education system is on salaries and benefits. It's our teachers. Our teachers also live here, so it's our community members. And Nebraska very much reflects this. So Lincoln and Omaha, again, it's between 70 and 80%. Scotts Bluff is right there too. So in Nebraska, the biggest piece of the pie is being spent on our educators, on people in our community, which has a double benefit of we're educating our youth, but also we're providing an economic opportunity in our communities by having those teachers. All right, let's talk about all K through 12 education in Nebraska, just to give some context of the sizes we're dealing with here. And you'll see here in each of these charts, we've got the blue is public, the purple is non-public or private, and then the red is homeschool. So you'll see the vast majority of our students in the state of Nebraska attend public schools. Only about 10% attend private or non-public, and 2% are homeschooled, although that number has been increasing significantly the past few years. When you look at the number of schools, we're talking about 1,200 schools in the state. And again, the portion that is schools that are private or non-public is larger than the amount of students there. So again, the implications of that as far as student-teacher ratios or access to resources, it has some impact there. It's another good time to point out that some of the resources are shared. So for example, in Nebraska, public schools are required to provide services for students with disabilities. Private schools are not necessarily required to do that out of their own school. And so a lot of times, students with disabilities who might attend a private school will get the services they need from a public school or a public school employee. So there's some sharing that goes on too. And you can see there when we're talking about teachers, there are 26,000 folks who work in our schools who are our teachers, and then 39,000 staff members. So again, sometimes I think what gets lost in this conversation about schools is these are our friends and neighbors. This is part of our community. It really is a community school in that it's not just about the students or the families, but also the teachers and the folks who live there. So let's talk specifically about public schools in Nebraska. You'll see there some quick stats about the number of students, the number of teachers. I also think it's helpful to point out some of these program participation, because sometimes we don't think about that when we're talking about school funding or things like that. You know, we have 7% of our students that are English learners. We have 46% of our public school students that are on free and reduced lunch. 13% are in a gifted program, and 16% are in special education. So those are just all considerations we need to look at when we talk about school funding. There are 244 districts statewide. The largest, not surprisingly, is Omaha Public Schools with just about 52,000 students. The smallest is McPherson Schools with 64 students. This blows my mind. Our largest district is 52,000 and our smallest district is 64 students. And I love to highlight this point because when we're making policy or trying to figure out funding options or things like that for our schools, we have this huge range we're working with. So that's something that's always helpful to keep in mind. Not every district looks the same. In fact, they can look very different. I mentioned this point earlier, but special education services in non-public schools are often provided by those public schools, whether that's through a staff member actually going to a program. And then just a point of context, we discussed earlier how roughly 80% of a school's budget is spent on staff and their salaries and benefits. We're not talking about extraordinary amounts of money here. So that's $58,000 as an average teacher's salary. And that really is someone who's probably been there for 10 years or so. So the lower range, a lot of our starting teachers are making in the mid 30s, maybe up to the 40s. And the highest level, and this might be someone with a master's who's taught for a long time, specialized, is maybe 70,000. That's kind of the range. So, we're talking about solid middle-class jobs here. I like to highlight this slide just to show all the different people who work in our schools. And I think of this as my own experience walking in with my sons. His kindergarten room is at the very end, so I get to see all of these things. When we walk in and we say hello to the gym teacher, who's the person doing crosswalk duty that day. And then the principal is out in the lobby saying hello to everyone. And on our way down, we pass the school counselor's office and then the library with all the media folks. And then only then do we get to his classroom. And that's not even seeing the folks who are doing custodial work, maybe technology folks, all sorts of things. So when we talk about our schools, we also need to think about our teachers and our staff and all these people that are providing support to our students. And then finally, the role of parents, families, and communities. And I'm going to try to do my best. Our teacher action team member is much better at covering this than I am. But she makes the point that in schools, your student has their teachers. There might be the staff. There are also volunteers or organizations. So there might be a tutoring program through a local nonprofit. There might be, a PTA type group. There might be the Boy Scouts, whatever it might be. There's other organizations, again, because it's a community school in the community, helping our kids grow and learn. And that's during their day. So think about that. I like to think of it when I worked full time, who the people I saw during my work day and then the people I saw at home were very different. And I was the same person throughout, but the experience I had with those individuals was different. And so that's really where this connection of parents and teachers and staffers is really important, because we all see a different element of student. Teachers really do think of parents as partners in education. The goal is the same. A happy, healthy kid who likes to learn. Hopefully that's the goal. And then the other out of school, as we kind of talked about with the curriculum guidelines, influences are policymakers. So that could be our State Board of Education setting curriculum guidelines. It might be your local school board making decisions about what books are in the classroom or available in the library. It also is your state senator who might be voting on policy related to funding. So elected positions are also an important part of this impact on your students. And when you're thinking about, who's going to best represent, who's going to do the best for your schools, they should always be putting the students first. The focus should always be on students first. And then teachers and staff is a close second, because those are the people, again, who are in that classroom with your kid all day, who experiences and knows what the pressure points is. So elected positions have an impact. And one of the best things you can do as a community member or a family member is being informed about where they stand. And you're doing a great job right now with Schools 101, learning a little bit about how our schools work. And then finally, this idea we mentioned right at the beginning, Our schools, we call them public schools, but they're really community schools because that is often what our community is based around. When we have a strong community school, we have a strong community. So that's why we think education is so important, and we have the data to back that idea up. So a thriving system equals a thriving community. Thank you so much for your time with joining us today to learn a little bit about Schools 101. Please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Rachel M. Gibson with the League of Women Voters. My email is rachel@lwvnebraska.org. If you would like us to come present at an event or a group that you have, we would be absolutely delighted. We can come in person, and we also do via Zoom. So distance is a concern. Don't worry, we can find a way to get around that. Otherwise, just keep doing what you're doing, being educated about issues, and here's to another great school year.